Ladies and gentlemen, Noah Smith, the esteemed former neoliberal shill, emeritus, a Bloomberg Opinion writer, has a great Substack of his own where we're going to talk about a little bit of what he's been writing recently. And I think actually our first return guest on our stream. Pretty incredible. Really just incredible stuff. So, Noah, it's good to have you. How are you doing tonight?
I'm honored. Hail to the current chief neoliberal shill.
Well, I'm trying to do my part. You know, I know my pedigree is not quite so esteemed, but I think I've got pizzazz. You know, I think I've got.
You're definitely
here.
more of a neoliberal and more of a shill than I ever was. So you're better than me on both counts.
Right on. So, first of all, there's some folks in the chat real quick. I suppose since we're going to hear this all night, it might be good to get out of the way. Show us the bunny. You have any bunnies nearby that you could maybe turn the camera?
Oh, they're asleep.
They're sleeping.
They're under the bed.
Well, we're not going to wake up the bunnies for that. Right?
This is their sleepy time. They actually, one of them came out yesterday when I was doing the official neoliberal Twitch stream.
Yeah.
And then we got to see one of the bunnies, but then the other, now they're just, if they come out, they might come out while we're on, and I'll show you.
All right, yeah, change your plans. Do not disturb bunny, they say.
So I mean, you just can't see them. It's a big bed.
Oh, I gotcha. So I wanted to ask. We were going to talk about development in East Asia. I also wanted to ask, though. I've seen that you've gotten embroiled in another couple of recent sort of controversy is the right word, but you know, it seems like it on carbon taxes and yesterday on immigration with our friends in the National Conservative Movement.
Our friends.
Yeah, yeah. So, I want to ask first of all if you'd be open to talking about some of those issues too.
Absolutely.
So, first of all, I've seen this new group of people who call themselves national conservatives, who are what they appear to be doing is taking the Trump ideology and sort of trying to make it respectable, like trying to formalize it. You know, this idea of
how do they pick that name?
I know
it's Nat-C's. Nat-C's. Did they not think of that? Anyway,
I didn't think of that. Whoa. Okay.
Now there's my gift too. You'll never be able to unsee that. Nat-C. Yeah.
Folks, big if true, and it is quite true. So, yeah, wow, okay. Well, we're gonna remember that one. We'll be storing that one down the line. Yeah. So it's this group of people who are trying to make, I guess, Trumpism into an ideology rather than sort of an opportunistic grab bag of reactionary nonsense. And they've been fighting pretty hard on immigration with folks like you and folks from the Cato Institute. And I guess I want to get real quick. What's your take on this movement?
Well, I wrote it today in a new post.
Oh, wow.
So if you go to noopinion.substack.com, you can read my new post all about this. But basically the idea is that there were three main pillars of Reaganite conservatism,
mm-hmm.
and those three pillars were like social, economic, and foreign policy. And on the social side, it was conservative Christianity, which I grew up with. I don't know if you're old enough to have grown up with that,
mm-hmm.
those guys. And then on economic stuff, it was laissez-faire, Milton Friedman, whatever, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
At least lip service thereof.
Yeah.
And then on foreign policy, it was this sort of muscular internationalism that kind of eventually gave us Bush. This sort of like wave the flag and bomb some stuff. We're inherently the good guys and we've got the guns kind of deal.
Yeah.
And so those three pillars all collapsed. The latter foreign policy thing collapsed in the Iraq War. The economic approach really collapsed in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Christianity, it never really it doesn't fail. Like you can't say, oh, Christianity didn't work unless you're dead. But short of that, you don't know. And so instead what happened is that people just stopped going to church, and that people stopped really, like a lot of people are no longer identifying as religious no longer going to church. And so that, I think it's the internet, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think the internet is making us irreligious because strong religions like that are really created for tight-knit communities, and the internet just makes everything vertical. It makes everything like your best friend is like someone, I don't know, like halfway around the world in like Philippines or somewhere, not like your neighbor. And so I think that that's what really killed it, but we can argue about that all day. But anyway, the point is that conservatives, after all that stuff, really had not much to hold on to, no real center, no real core that hadn't been dealt a giant blow in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I think that they've turned to this idea of dispossession, of replacement, as the alternative to the, as the only available center, the only available thing they can really hold on to when those other things are gone. And this idea, I mean, partly it's nostalgia, like everyone likes the good old days, the way things used to be. Partly it's demographic change, white people becoming a minority, and things like that. And partly it's simply this feeling of taking the losses that they've suffered and turning that into this sort of like revenge narrative, kind of like the Lost Cause did for the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I mean, to be honest, it's a little bit like, Germans did after World War One. It's this idea of like, did we really lose, or was our country stolen from us?
That is such a frustrating comparison, though, because I mean, it's how can conservatives feel like they have lost when they just had a president, they just had Congress, they've got the Supreme Court. I mean, they had 8 years of Obama before that, but they had 8 years of Bush before that. It's not like Republicans have been shut out of Congress or the White House. I mean, I know that in the 20th century, for example, Republicans were shut out of control of the House of Representatives for about 40 years at one point. I mean, now, though, they, for whatever, they seem to have a hard time getting majorities when they win, right? They seem to have a real hard time getting majority of the population, but they seem to have the levers of power now and then, right?
Yeah, but that's not enough because, they that's like their last desperate thing. They feel dispossessed in cultural terms, in demographic terms. If nobody, like if your next door neighbors are immigrants, you feel like, oh my gosh, where did my homogeneous majority go, or whatever the shit.
Yeah.
And then if nobody's going to church, you're like, okay, what happened to that? Maybe you're not even going to church, but it's this cascade effect. You're like, what happened to this? People don't sort of like acknowledge you as the natural, like, a member of the dominant group of your country. Feels like you lost your country. And probably we shouldn't have created such a strong feeling of mastery in the first place. We should have been a more pluralistic society back in the 80s, or and before. But we were what we were, and now things are changing, and things change and evolve. There were differential birth rates. We had immigration. Immigration was part of it, but also economic changes. The decline of like small towns due to the decline of manufacturing and everybody moving to the big coastal cities. That really displaces a lot of people left behind and makes them feel like where the action isn't where they are, right? And they're living in a decaying, half-empty town. Sorry. Here's where I depart from neoliberalism, is thinking that the idea of help people, not places.
Yeah.
The idea of everybody just move away from the crappy places. Well, if half the people move away, the other half of the people are really screwed.
Yeah.
Because, then you have a town that's half empty. It's full of like, I don't know, like meth houses and like bashed in storefronts and like roads that nobody has the tax money to fix.
Yeah.
And so like,
yeah, I remember driving through West Virginia one time a few years back, and I drove through a road that it went through several of these kind of small towns that were punctuated by these big coal mining operations.
Right.
And
the old coal towns.
The public services were all marked like those newer public services were all marked with advertisements that said, this is brought to you by the Friends of Coal, the Friends of Coal, the Friends of Coal Society. Like, but apart from that, it did seem like there was a lot of kind of I guess, decaying buildings and a lot of.
There's a hell of a lot of decay. You go through the Rust Belt. There's a hell of a lot of decay, but it's not just regional. It's worse in those areas, but it's nationwide. It's really the rural to urban shift, and of course, it's causing problems in the cities too, because the cities won't build housing, so people can't fit in the damn cities, and then nobody wants to live in the small towns, and so it's like the big geographic mismatch. And if you look at the idea of red states and blue states is dead as a doornail. Instead, what if you look at an election map that has any granularity at all, what you see is like little pockets of urban blue surrounded by giant pockets of small town red.
Yeah.
That's our actual electoral geography. And the red states and blue states are just states that happen to be a little more or less urbanized. That's it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, so I guess there are a few things about what you said. And you, I didn't know you had actually just written a piece about this. So I didn't mean this to be like an ambush. I just saw,
No. I wrote, I expect people to ask me about the thing I wrote about this morning. That's the thing that was automatic preparation.
Yeah. Oh, right on. Yeah. I was just thinking about kind of the exchanges we'd had with some of these folks.
And I wrote that because of the people yelling about immigration.
Yeah.
That's what made me write that.
Well, so there are a couple of things about that I'm curious about. At least one about immigration and diversity, and then two, the economic situation you mentioned.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sorry I haven't read the piece yet, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. So on diversity, one of the things that is hard for me to understand about that is I'm 33. I grew up in Florida. I grew up in a small town in southwest Florida called Port Charlotte. So it's not a particularly interconnected, urbanized area. It's just Is
that near Tampa?
Yeah, about an hour south of Tampa.
Okay.
But I had diversity my whole life in school and college, and went to I went to school in Florida. I mean, I've seen this kind of my whole life. It doesn't feel like. I don't know. I mean, where is this idea? Like, is that just really recent? Like, is this just me in my recent life here that I've had this experience, but other people did not? Because I've just never had a life without people from other countries, without, Well,
when you're talking about the people who experienced that homogeneous white or white and black America, you're talking about older people. You're talking about people who were alive that America basically started to end in the early 80s and started to end really in the 80s. And in the 70s, that was still our nadir of foreign-born population as a percent of the population, our lowest ever in the 70s.
Wow.
And people who remember the 70s remember that. So Generation X people, they were kids then. They remember that keenly. Boomers, especially silent generation people, the real old people now, they remember an America that was very different. And starting with millennials, then it started to change. And even me, I grew up in a college town, so I grew up with diversity. But had I grown up in a lot of places in America, even me, I wouldn't have had as much diversity. And it really started to change. I mean, it started to change in the 80s, but it really accelerated the change in the 90s. And so 90s kids, they grew up with diversity, and that's the watershed there. But you're also, there's this other contingent of the Richard Spencer type of people who we think of these as like white power people.
Right.
But white power is no longer this, massive dominant like thing. Like back in the 60s, if white people just wanted to crush everybody, they could just do that. But right now, white people are a minority of young people. And so Richard Spencer has become minoritized. He thinks of himself as an oppressed minority. And of course, other people do not think of him as an oppressed minority. But the point is that he thinks of himself that way, and he's reacting to that incredibly badly. If you are an oppressed minority, right. If you are, I know that nobody thinks he is, but right. If you think you're an oppressed minority, what you do not do is you do not say, I am the master race, ha ha ha, I will fuck you up, ha ha ha. You don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, I guess some of the Nation of Islam people did that. And that turned out badly for them.
Yeah.
And like, it's not going to turn out well, especially because everyone's like, you're white, dude. But even if you were right, he's still not reacting appropriately. So you've got these, sort of young Republican kind of guys who were, very Trumpist. They feel that they are an oppressed minority group, and they're reacting to that by basically acting out constantly. They're just acting out.
Really?
And yeah, they're acting out. I mean, even...
Well, what do you mean by that, though?
I mean, so you look at the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys run around just like making, acting like a gang and like wreaking havoc and like fighting people and stuff like that. That is an inappropriate thing to do. Yeah. Don't do that. I mean, like, is that bear saying? Like, don't do that shit. Like, no matter, like, there's no reason to do that. It won't help you. And that's it's sort of a miniature version. The people who did the shambolic, shitty coup attempt on January 6th were mostly not the Proud Boys, but they were mostly just like a whole bunch of random like realtors and like whatever boat dealers or whatever from around the country who were just complete idiots. But it was the same animating impulse as this idea of like throwing a massive temper tantrum. When you feel like you're losing your country, you throw a giant temper tantrum and just act out and flail.
Yeah, it's actually funny you mention that. There's a fellow by the name of Suspect Sushi who used to be a streamer on Twitch who was recently in the news for being arrested in connection with all that. So somebody that we have talked to on this channel before
has now been arrested for a coup. Yeah. All right. Well, all I have to say is go to actual jail.
Yeah.
Bonk.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well,
because that's what's going to happen. You're going to go to jail because, surprise, the National Guard isn't on your side and isn't going to like mutiny and restore white supremacy. Well, surprise, the army is not going to do that.
Well, like, I mean, you know what? The first thing
think that the army would just like, rise up and join them. I mean, like,
I know there wasn't much of a plan there, But
I don't think there was much of a plan. But I don't think there's much of a plan. And one problem is that these people are living in this dream world of their own construction. Like many of our politics-focused subcultures, like tankies or like, the left NIMBYs or whatever. Like a lot of people, they have created their own fantasy world and then just moved into the fantasy world they created. It's like they spun this fantasy, but it wasn't just for marketing. They tricked themselves into believing it. The QAnoners. Oh my God, that's the worst.
I know, but you know what the first thing these folks say when we talk about force and violence is, what about 2020 when there were violent riots in cities all across America, and now we're focusing on this attack on Congress and we're focusing on the Proud Boys? I mean, why are we doing that? I mean, crime rates are spiking, and this is the kind of stuff we hear when we talk about these issues. And, when I try and say, look, that attack on Congress was a big deal. It's the first thing that folks who are, sympathetic will say.
Right. And so there's also a difference between when the entire country does it and when a few goobers do it. When the entire country gets mad, you've got to listen. Yeah. When a few goobers get mad, you don't. And so really... But when you're talking about 2020, when you're talking about like the George Floyd protests, those protests, if you look at the percent of violent protests, they were approximately the same as in any protest ever, like in a normal protest. The violent protests were like, a 2% or something of the incidents, because, when you have a big protest and the police are distracted with the protest, violent people come out and set fire to shit and smash windows and take things. That's what happens. That's what happens in protests. There were only a couple cities, Seattle and especially Portland, where the protesters got out of hand and just started wreaking havoc. Yeah. And, in Seattle, it was in a very short space of time. It was the Chaz, which ended in tragedy when Chaz security shot some black kids. Yeah. And that was complete acting out. I mean, like, my message to those people is the same. Like, you are stop that. Don't do that. Like, Hobbes was right. You can't just create an anarchist zone. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for anarchists, but like, that was dumb. And I don't know. Then Portland is really the case where the lefty protesters have just gotten way out of hand. They're just like, they're still smashing stuff like all the time. They're still starting fires all the time. And like, what are you going to do? What good have you done?
I don't know what you've done in the process,
stupid.
like at this point, other than give animating impulse to your extremists across the aisle.
Maybe, or just drive all the hipsters out of Portland.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like Portland, Portlandia is just going to be Mad Max now. It's going to be like the Portlandia Mad Max mashup. And you know what? Fine. You ruined your hipster town. That's fine. It just would have become corporate anyway. Like, might as well go out
They
with a
saved
bang.
it. Yeah, they killed it so that it could not be killed. Right?
Yeah, like, Paris did the same thing. Paris always does this. Paris is like, you know what? You corporatize my city? No, I smash it. It's like, and then they just smash Paris. Like, that's what Paris people always do. They just smash it up. And so I can sort of see that, but like also it's stupid. Yeah. Like the yellow vest people in Paris.
Oh my
You're
God.
not a revolutionary.
It's actually
fucking Jacobins. You're not like, do you hear the people sing? You're just bored.
Well, it was funny. It was funny actually. We were I was thinking about the Paris Commune the other day. I was listening to some documentary about it, and it's kind of
the
funny
original Chaz.
Yeah, how history sort of repeats, but the folks who got out in Paris in yellow vests, they weren't just acting up. I mean, they had some economic concerns. In fact, some kind of, I think, conservative, type economic concerns, I believe. There's groups of
anti-tax,
and anti-tax, and so I mean, there were some animating economic type impulses there. I know you were talking about in this country cities that have been or rather communities that have been sort of hollowed out.
Right.
By deindustrialization. Now, whenever I talk about trade, I am always saying something to the effect of, look, folks, there are people who, with any policy, will win and lose, but with respect to trade, we have seen time and time and time and time again, there have been far more winners than there have been losers, and all we really need to do is take some of those gains and spread them out so the people who didn't, win out from global trade can be better off too. And I wonder, with what you're saying here, am I just selling the false song of globalism? I think as Trump put it at one point. Like, well,
yeah.
Is that
yes
why?
No. In
Why
a way,
people,
yes, in a way, no.
Yeah. Okay.
So the idea of compensate the losers was always kind of a phantasm because, as even economists who wrote that noted, it's just politically and bureaucratically often impossible to do that. Like, remember when you're talking about compensating the losers, you're talking about taking massive, broad, systemic shifts in our economy, in our geography, in our industries, all this stuff. And you're talking about having government fix it. Do you believe in government's power to fix it?
Well, I mean, wasn't government preserving what was there before with respect to, the trade restrictions and
tariffs? It was. That's right. So the thing is that, like, if you believe that government can come in and like save all the towns and save all the people's careers and blah, 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 compensate the losers. But I'm just saying that for a thing that's traditionally associated with economic liberalism, the idea of compensating the losers is startlingly reliant on massive, detailed, comprehensive government intervention in the economy. Because that's what compensating the losers would really mean. And needless to say, we haven't been able to do it. And we never really had much of a plan for doing it. I mean, trade adjustment assistance is like this tiny little thing that, even if it had worked, which it didn't really, it's just so small. And there was never any real attempt to compensate the losers. And so the question is whether, and Danny Roderick asked this question. Danny Roderick is an economist in good standing. He takes all the econ theory seriously and everything. But his question is there a way to do this in a way that maintains the gains from trade, but avoids some of the losses? Is there just a better way to do it?
Yeah.
And of course, my big idea in terms of how we should intervene in trade is export subsidies. I think that, I could go into all that, but I think that essentially instead of protectionism, instead of trying to protect our domestic market, which is bad, I think, we should push our people to go out and sell into the world market, which is pro-globalization. It's pro-trade. It's a government intervention in the process of trading. It's putting your thumb on the scale for some companies, but it's also pro-trade itself. So it's not free trade, but it's pro-trade. And so I think that, And so Krugman, made his bones with new trade theory in the economics profession before he became a stimulus guy, whatever. And then this is back in like the 80s, 90s. And the big idea was that Japan makes cars and sells them to us. We make cars and sell them to Japan.
Yeah.
We don't really, because our cars are too heavy for Japanese roads, but we do make a lot of phones and sell them to Japan. So Japan makes electronics and sells them to us. We make electronics and sell them to Japan. Like, good old David Ricardo comparative advantage theory says, what? Why?
Yeah.
Just make your own phones. But new trade theory by Krugman says, actually, because our phones are slightly different and people have a preference for variety, we end up selling phones to each other. So what if Japan subsidizes their phone sales to us and we subsidize our phone sales to Japan? Maybe we can increase trade, but we can also, and thus create a strong constituency of exporters. Because remember, it's all about those concentrated political constituencies. If we have exporters who get to sell phones to Japan, they'll be like, hold up, don't cut off trade.
Yeah.
And then we get a coalition, we get a constituency for trade, but also we push our companies. And this is my theory. I've read some empirical papers that give me this idea, and it's based on the book How Asia Works as well. But the idea is that if we subsidize our phones to Japan, Japan subsidizes their phones to us, we're pushing our companies to compete in a strange, weird new market that they might not understand, which ultimately pushes them to become more productive.
Like more, they have to innovate out of necessity.
Right, exactly. And there's this well-known thing in the finance world called home bias among investors.
Yeah.
You buy stocks from your own country, but and there's various reasons for that. But there's also probably that in businesses. So you go after customers you understand, and you just, are like satisfied, and you want a quiet life, and you just sell stuff to the people you know. But then the government's like, no, actually, no, go sell stuff to Japan and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and Korea and France. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then now we've got to work.
Well, so let me ask you about that. I mean, when you're doing export subsidies, aren't you just throwing cash at other countries?
When you do export subsidies, are you throwing cash at other countries?
Right,
partly you are, and partly to our own country.
Okay, so it's like envisioned as a sort of, like, I guess let me ask you this first of all. If
it's envisioned as a reciprocal, as everybody does it, and then it's better if everybody does it.
Okay, so it's better if everybody does it.
Us, we're throwing cash at them.
Is it something that, as you've envisioned it, I know that, in the 80s when Milton Friedman was talking about complete free trade, he would say, look, it would be better, of course, if everybody did it, but we could still do it on our own and we'd be better off. Is it your opinion that we would be, even if we were the only ones doing it, that we would be better off?
It's possible. It's a hypothesis. Well, I think it's worth a try.
The reason I'm curious... Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no, I just think that if I'm right about these productivity benefits, then yes. If I'm wrong about it, then no. Well, but it might be a politically good thing to do anyway, just for domestic political shit.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
Like if we're the only, like South Korea and Vietnam, both they subsidize exports a lot through various ways, through currency manipulation, through which we should let them do because they're our allies. We need to get factories to move out of China into those countries, and so then. But they do that, and they do export subsidies that we don't match on our end, and like sometimes it works for them, but I think it props up their governments. In the case of Vietnam, they're not the friendliest government. South Korea is pretty nice, but
Vietnam is we're allies. We're friends now, right?
Yeah, we're friends, and we should be much closer allies with Vietnam than we are. Yeah. In fact, that's going to be a new No Opinion blog post in a couple days. Ally with Vietnam.
Sounds good.
It's going to be our thing.
So
anyway, so there's
sounds good.
Whatever with the export subsidies, I just think that with the problem was that people had cried, like foul over trade. People had like freaked out over trade again and again so many times with Japan, with Germany, with France, with all this stuff. And each time it turned out that the benefit was larger than the cost. With trade with Japan, like there were no large-scale enduring harms to U.S. workers. Workers who were displaced from industries that competed directly with Japan tended to find manufacturing jobs in industries that didn't compete directly with Japan during the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
So people were displaced, but they managed to find other manufacturing jobs. The time that this became non-true was when China entered the WTO, and suddenly it's like all our old certainties were turned on their head, and it was different. And Autor, if you look at Autor's paper, he shows this. He's like just showing how it was qualitatively different, and it may have just been quantity. I mean, as either Lenin or Stalin or one of the Soviet guys said,
quantity has a quality all its own.
Thank you. And so it may have just been China was so damn big and so damn cheap and so damn fast to come onto the world stage that just overwhelmed everything else. Because there is evidence that this China shock that displaced a bunch of people lasted for 1 decade only.
Yeah.
If you read Nicholas Bloom's paper with a bunch of people whose names come after B, but Bloom's paper will show that the China shock ended at the Great Recession.
Yeah, that's the thing. I haven't.
It was 9 years long.
I haven't read that. But we talked with Scott Linscomb, who I know you've talked about the export subsidies. I think you had a debate of sorts with him about that.
On the
neoliberal podcast, yeah.
That's right.
And I know that he talked about the China shock, but he said that it was sort of overstated and that it did, come to an end after a few years.
It was about 9 years long, but it was big.
Yeah.
Like, it hit a lot of people. And if you like political science papers that show correlations, the counties that it hit harder went harder for Trump.
Yeah. Well, so that's what I guess I'm curious about is ideas like that, interventions like that. It seems like if somebody like me were to get interested in them, it would be for political reasons, not really because not really because I'm sold on the productivity idea. I mean, that sounds good. I hope it's true, right? I mean, that'd be great. But it seems like the primary thing that's interesting here to somebody who's skeptical is the notion of, well, look, otherwise it's really difficult politically to help these people. And they're drifting into movements that are increasingly unmoored from the consensus that the United States should be a pluralistic democratic country.
Right.
And so...
And it's, and I think what we're realizing is that, like, policies for a country cannot be made directly from textbooks.
Yeah. You
can't just crack open Mankiw and say, like, okay, well, let's do this. Things don't work like that. There's just so many reasons why things don't work like that. That doesn't mean it's not good to read textbooks, but it has to be just one thing that informs your calculus. And I think that as a nation, we're sort of waking up and realizing this. And I think that our Cold War victory was so decisive and our economic dominance in the 90s so clear because we had a head start on the internet and all this other stuff that we had this cushion where we could do textbook stuff and get away with it for a little while, ignore the complexities. And then we wake up and like, oh no, we deregulated finance too much and it blew up our economy. Oops. And then like, oh no, we let China hold down the value of the yuan and blah, 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 blah. And like a bunch of people lost their jobs. Oops. And like, oh, we cut taxes like past a certain point. It didn't stimulate any economic activity. Oops. Yeah. And like so many oopses because we were just like, throwing Mankiw textbook at the world. And like, we got away with it for a little while and it caught up with us, I think.
Well, so I guess there are a couple of things about that are a couple of implications there that are somewhat, I guess, disturbing or frustrating. One, is it the opinion of, saying what you just said, I guess, first of all, I think about countries in Europe, like the, more socially democratic countries in Europe, like, say France or Denmark, for example. And I know you're in touch with all this stuff too, so you've probably seen that Denmark recently cut the residency permits for Syrian refugees. It said, oh yeah, Syria's safe. You can go back, And in France, there was a poll done that came out today that found that I think 1 out of 3 French millennials was on board with Marine Le Pen. And I don't know if you'd seen that, but she was by far the most popular candidate among millennials. And I'm thinking if these, okay, maybe I could sign up with some social welfare if what is driving this kind of reactionary politics is a sense of unease and economic uncertainty. But these are countries where there's a lot less, I think, economic uncertainty, where people are...
That's right.
Where states have a more active role. And while the individuals in those countries are, I think, as a whole, one-to-one, not as rich in GDP terms as we are, they have a lot more guarantees, socially. And
Right.
yet they're going, there's a lot of reactionary politics there. So
Absolutely.
what's the sense
Economics
of,
are not, economics is, like freedom from want is not an insulation against popular anger.
Yeah.
People care about stuff that's not just dollars in their pocket. And the pure materialist hypothesis is just wrong. And, the DSA often gets this wrong. And a lot of people get this wrong. This idea that that economics smooths everything over. It helps. It doesn't hurt. But this idea that, like, this materialist idea, which really comes from Marx, that we can just trace everything back to dollars in people's pockets, isn't really right. People care about goofy stuff. People care about like we'll let like hundreds of thousands of our people die from a pandemic because we don't want to stop eating at Sizzler, and then we'll and then a foreign country blows up one of our ships and kills like 40 people. We're like, war.
Yeah.
And then go kill an equal number of people. And so we are, like a plane crashes, we're like, I'm never flying again. A car crashes, we're like, oh, you suck, you're a bad driver. 1,000 cars crash, oh, you're a bad driver. One plane crashes, I'm never flying again. Terrorism, it's like 40,000 people die of car accidents, and
every year
people die of terrorism. Right? We're like, oh my God, war, let's give up our civil liberties. We overreact to things, but you know what? You gotta, people want what they want. We're not rational beings. What we care about. The utility function is the utility function. And to some degree, we've got to just bow to that. And humans are weird and stupid and crazy.
Well, so the
I like us anyway.
The policy implications of that kind of worldview are kind of daunting, don't you think? It seems like, for example, if that's the case, how do you sell people on good policy? If indeed we think
very
that
carefully,
how do you talk about something like immigration or trade? Then if I know we talked to Brian
any policy
Kaplan
that we did that you think was good, and go read a detailed history of how that policy was conceived and enacted, and you'll be like, oh my God, what is this? You'll just think, how the hell do we? It's always down to all these little coincidences. Read about the Hart-Celler Act. The Immigration Reform 1965, where we repealed most of the racist immigration shit. And just look at the contingencies and the horse trading and the timing and just all the shit and the limitations of the bill and the weird reasons. Do you know that we did the family reunification immigration because of white nationalism?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, because people thought that the people who did all the family reunification immigration would be people with European families. They'd bring over European people, but if we did, they thought, oh, if we make it all employment based, like some of these other smaller countries are doing, if we make it mostly employment based, then a whole bunch of Asian people are going to come in and change the race of our country. And we're like, well, we can't have that. And then now all the immigration restriction is like, oh my God, family reunification, because guess who actually reunified their families? Not the Europeans. And so unintended consequences, man. It's how the sausage gets made is crazy. And so we have to listen to the greatest capitalist reformer who ever lived, Deng Xiaoping.
Okay, what is he? Doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice.
That, but also his famous maxim of cross the river by feeling the stones. And so we can't just here is our constraint. Here's our constraint set, and here's our utility function. Find the optimal point. We can't just do that to get to the optimal place. We've got to experiment with some shit. I mean, all this literature that's coming out about the minimum wage and how minimum wage actually isn't that damaging. It has some costs, but it's not nearly as much as people thought. And that wouldn't have happened if politicians hadn't said, screw you, economists, I'm going to do what I feel like today. And then just did some stuff. And then our legions of empirical economists come along and it didn't fail. And then but at the time in 1990, when New Jersey was doing it or whatever, 89, whatever, all the economists are like, this is going to fail. This is going to fail. And they're like, well, politics makes us do it anyway. And it worked. So, we can use data to give ourselves good feedback, and we can use theory to inform what we do. But at the end of the day, we've got to experiment. And sometimes politics is one of the things that makes us experiment with stuff that might have seemed dumb in the past. And if you think about it, that's the only way that we ever got from the pre-modern world to the modern world anyway, was just constant experimentation.
Yeah.
So if I have one message, it's that. It's cross the river by feeling the stones, experiment and get feedback, and trial and error. It's how every startup works, right? Every successful startup does this.
How do we? How am I supposed to support Deng Xiaoping, who also, I mean, just today, I mean, these
Deng Xiaoping, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's got
gunned down hundreds of.
Yeah, he also, I mean, in addition to the capitalist reform, I mean, he offed, I think, the one member of the Chinese Communist Party who was interested in some political reform. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Zhao Ziyang, I think.
I'd have
to pull it up.
He also invaded Vietnam.
Yeah, that one didn't go so well.
Deng Xiaoping invaded Vietnam, and of course Vietnam won.
Yeah.
Bloomberg let me write that. Bloomberg let me write, when I mentioned that, they let me put a parenthetical saying naturally Vietnam won. Because you just don't fuck with Vietnam.
Well, hey, I think it's a lesson, a hard to learn lesson, but nevertheless.
People, they keep doing it. It's like in the Rocky movies. Like, people keep thinking they can knock Rocky out, and it doesn't work in the movies. It's like, because you can just continually hit him for like 2 hours, and then he'll like land one punch and win.
It's kind of wild. I remember digging into like the history of Vietnam, and it's like China has tried to subdue Vietnam half a dozen times over the last like 2,000 years, more probably.
More.
And it's the same thing every time. Stay for a while, eventually you're gone. Somebody had the chance at around 17 times. So, well, okay.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so then what about the culture issue then? Because we talked about, I know this is far off the path of development of climate, but, we talked about kind of the economic angle, and that we've just got to, I guess we've got to work with people's kind of anti-market bias there.
To some degree, but like anti-market bias goes away pretty fast when like markets start making money.
Yeah.
So like I'm not as depressed about anti-market bias as I think people are. Yeah. I think that once markets start making people money, they're like, markets.
Yeah.
And so I think we just have to slightly rig the market so they make everybody money. Like in Japan, there was this for a long time until people stopped having kids and all the businesses started getting sold to private equity. But for generations, Japan had this massive small business culture that was one of the main pillars of the middle class. And I saw some analysis showing that about like a third of the middle class were like small business people. Mm-hmm. And if you look at like, Jiro dreams of sushi or whatever, like that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's this small business culture. They really put their thumb on the scale for small business.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, like it was really hard for big businesses to come out and outcompete your corner store, whatever. It was less productive,
mm-hmm.
But it was so mercantile, and it created this giant constituency for capitalism as an idea.
Yeah.
That Japan was never in serious danger of going communist, and it created a huge part of the middle class that felt themselves to be capital owners. It was an ownership society. It was inefficient. It was not Mankiw textbook. It lowered their GDP overall.
Mm-hmm.
It was an inefficient, even as a method of redistribution of income.
Yeah.
It was bad because you could have just given people cash. That would have been better. And yet the politics of it, of creating a vast, small holding capitalist middle class who feels a deep sense of ownership in the idea of markets and capitalism,
mm-hmm.
and who goes out every day looking to make money and thinking about business and thinking that's what you do.
Yeah.
Like that was incredibly important in Japanese politics, and meant that the left never really got a foothold. And so you're like, oh my God, so inefficient. Oh my God. And then you're like, and yet Japan has a noted dearth of crazy government shit since World War II.
Yeah.
It's done some bad ideas. It built too much infrastructure in the 90s. It did some other dumb things, but mostly it's been pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Even their fiscal stimulus was better. Like they should have had a big depression. Instead, they just had like a lost decade. But
Yeah, like
Could have been
they
worse.
stopped growing. They didn't shrink.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
stopped growing.
Unemployment went to all the way to 5%. Um, and so like Japan doesn't always get it right, but
Yeah.
they were in a neighborhood of the world where a lot of people got it incredibly wrong in the mid to late 20th century. They could have been, Japan could have gone communist. They could have done a lot of stupid stuff, and yet they didn't. And I think that this, analyses I've seen of the Japanese small business class. So that's markets. Like it's not free markets. It's not Milton Friedman. It's not, but it's vast numbers of people getting up every day and thinking about buying and selling things.
Yeah.
It's mercantile.
That's really interesting to me because I guess when I started doing the streaming thing, I picked the name Bastiat because I liked his book, The Law, and I liked, the big ideas.
I've never read Bastiat,
right?
actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a good book that basically says, legislators, think about people like your people and not like their clay just to mold as you see fit. And, and now he's sort of a libertarian folk hero. But I thought, you know what? I like that idea. This is a kind of a name that kind of sounds good, so I'll go with that. And one thing I occasionally run into is some libertarian, real hardcore kind of real free market type person will say, who the hell are you to call yourself a neoliberal or free market or to say you're interested in these ideas? And I guess my response is, I'm interested in them because I want to push them as far as I can without, a system that can't sustain itself, that collapses into something because people feel like, I like freedom on paper, but it doesn't deliver to me in practice. You know what I mean? Right. And so what you just said about Japan is super interesting because it reminds me of, Matt Bruning wrote this article, I think, in Jacobin at some point a while back where he said, small business isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Right.
And I'm thinking, as persuasive as that was, I can see that being a helpful socialist argument because if people don't feel like they are plugged into capitalism, or if they feel like, what capitalism is to them is, just kind of bosses rather than markets, that's really interesting.
A great way to get people acclimated to the idea of having government boss them around is to have a mega corporation boss them around, which is essentially a government from where you're standing.
Damn. Well, so these national conservatives who get upset every time somebody's banned off of Twitter are right then, right? This is fascism just around the corner.
I guess, yeah. The problem is that there's such a vacuum on the right that these Nazis are going to, they're the only intellectual game in town. And when you're the only intellectual game in town, it's like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like in the land of the complete collapse of conservative intellectuals, half-baked conservative intellectuals that also happen to be kind of fascist.
Well,
are king.
That's the thing that's interesting is I see these folks, they will, to their credit, they will occasionally call somebody out like PragerU or Young Americans for Freedom or one of these more traditional type conservative groups that will just sort of push the usual pablum, or they'll say, you people are jokers, we're the real deal, and they'll say, you people, ruined everything, you ruined Iraq, they'll, call out Bill Kristol a lot, who was kind enough to come on our stream, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
But,
follows me on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. I didn't get the chance to ask him about his plans for Cuba, but, he was talking about annexing Cuba on Twitter, but,
That's Bill Kristol.
but yeah, it's, so I think that's also a really interesting point. They're kind of like the only game in town at the moment.
Only game on the right, yeah. And so that worries me. Like,
do you see anybody else on the right kind of, in the intellectual ferment?
No, I mean, there's people, the on the cultural stuff who don't even think about economic stuff. On economic stuff, it was just like free markets, tax cuts, that's it. And then, no, actually, let's just have, it's the National Conservative Economic Program is incoherent. It's Peronist. Because what it really is instead, I mean, both parties are now kind of like, industrial policy focused. But I would say that the National Conservatives are more focused on yoking industrial policy to culture war stuff.
Yeah.
And so let's tax corporations that don't say the political things we like.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff is goofy and stupid and bad and will be struck down by the courts. and I don't think it'll be popular, but it is like, it's not a great economic program. Like, let's tax this company that said something bad about our party.
Yeah. Well,
That's a bad economic program. It's like, it's personalistic, it's ad hoc, it's national conservatives look extremely Latin American. I'm going to insult Latin America by using that phrase. They look like Latin American rightists. They look like Perón, and to be honest, they look like Pinochet, because Pinochet is not nearly as good an economic leader as everybody thinks. He actually like did a bunch of meddling in the economy and caused a giant bubble at the same time. So like Pinochet is not.
Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about these kind of Perón and Pinochet.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's hard, like, even asking economists from these countries to summarize what is Peronism, ask an Argentinian to summarize what is Peronism. It is whatever Perón got up and felt like doing in the economy.
Yeah.
Yoked to his sort of macho, like quasi-fascist, slightly like I'm so great kind of attitude. And it's, it's sort of like Trumpism, except that he did different things because he just woke up feeling in a different mood than Trump. But like the idea is the same. Like when Trump is like, oh, let's build a factory in this Wisconsin a region that makes no sense and like wasted a bunch of money, or like, I'm going to call up this carrier company and yell at them for moving this plant or whatever. That's Peronism. It's like, there's no philosophy behind it. It's personalistic. It is ad hoc. It is arbitrary. And ultimately it's yoked to culture wars. And I don't understand the culture wars of Argentina. I probably should understand them so I can understand Peronism better. Pinochet's basic idea was like, well, the most like pro-market thing Pinochet actually did was simply open up the country to massive foreign investment.
Yeah.
Guess what? It didn't go into factories. It just went into existing real estate. So foreign people came in, bought all the buildings, and then the foreigners a little later were like, we'll sell. And they sold, and it was this giant capital outflow, and it's this big crisis, economic crisis, after which Pinochet fell, and more reasonable people got put in power who actually did good economic stuff, and now Chile's a developed country.
Oh, you see, because the traditional narrative is that he was a fascist dictator, but he also he liberalized the economy while he was a fascist dictator. And I had never really looked into it much, apart from the fascist dictator bit, and I'd just taken that part for granted because that's conventional wisdom. But it sounds like you're saying, not really.
Not really. I mean, most of what, he was not a great manager of the economy. I wrote a thread about it, and Pseudo Erasmus, the Dutch guy. I forget his real name. No one cares. It's just Pseudo Erasmus. He's like an economic historian from the Netherlands, and he did like this. He wrote up a very erudite explanation of why Pinochet was bad for the economy. I mean, people, like the libertarians and the rightists love him because they think, or the rightists anyway, love him because they think he's better than Allende, who is this like very much central planning oriented guy who thought he could like buy all these banks of computers that would tell the economy exactly what to produce. It was like something out of a cartoon.
CyberSyn with these computers in a circle, and they were going to be dialed into every factory, and
That's right. That existed. And so that was, that wouldn't have done well, but then maybe they would have like reformed. Pinochet killed a bunch of people, threw people out of helicopters for basically this, Pinochet was a little bit Erdoganian. I would say he's somewhat similar to Erdogan, but like more murderous. Yeah. Like a more murderous Erdogan. And he, but in his like economic policies, was kind of Erdoganian. And then he just like, he's, ultimately growth did not do great during his term. And then it did okay. It like was a little better than it had been in the crisis before Allende. And like, then it crashed when the housing bubble crashed. And then his government fell. And then like they actually democratically elected some reasonable centrists who just did smart stuff. And now it's good. And so really it's the nameless people who came after Pinochet. I don't even remember their names. Yeah. It's those people who actually fixed Chile. Yeah. Wow. They made Chile a great economy and one of the freest countries in the world. Freedom House ranks them as significantly freer than the United States.
Yeah. I mean, they just
And
had
it's
a
still protest, so
they just had a quasi revolution,
Big
a new constitution, and all that. And
yeah, new constitution. I mean, it was a relic of Pinochet's sort of like waning days
yeah.
when they made this new constitution. So they're like, oh, it was made under fascism, blah blah blah. I really think the protest. I mean, did you read my post about the big protest wave
No,
and
I didn't.
why it happened?
No, what was your thinking on that? Because I mean, it was triggered by the people who were talking about it. Were in a positive sense, we're saying it was triggered by decreasing standard of living, rising costs, and it was set off by I think a transit fee. That was the thing that really pushed over the edge, right?
Chilean standards of living were not falling; they were rising. They were rising at a somewhat slower pace than they had been.
Yeah.
Because of the crash in resource prices, Chile is still a resource exporter. So that maybe you have this revolution of rising expectations thing where it's like we had gotten used to growth and then growth slows and it's like, but maybe it's that. But you know what? I have this. So there's a lot of hypotheses. There are basically three hypotheses.
Yeah.
The first hypothesis is economic. The second hypothesis is it's just Twitter. And this is the Martin Gurri revolt of the public, Zeynep Tufekci, Twitter and tear gas hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's this idea that new technology makes it so much easier to get everybody mad. You share videos and photos of outrages, and then it's easier to organize. You're like, hey, everybody in my Instagram group, let's go to this protest.
Yeah.
And so, or Telegram, whatever. And then, so the idea is that technology has simply turned us into an eternal protest culture. And I don't believe that either, because I think you see giant protracted protest waves well before any of these technologies were invented. You see France basically had continuous protests for 100 years.
Yeah.
That arguably
19th century was rough on France. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like France didn't need Twitter. Yeah. France has France. Yeah. And like you saw massive protest waves at various times and places, and they didn't need Twitter. And so although I think it's a very interesting hypothesis and it might explain a shift in how movements work from leader movements to leaderless movements, I think that's an important shift. I think that in terms of the total amount of movements, I'm still skeptical of this hypothesis. The third hypothesis is simply that and this is the scary hypothesis that there is, I will wax dramatic for a moment.
All right. Let's hear it.
There is a wave of darkness creeping over our world.
That's not really a hypothesis so much as the beginning of a book, right?
Over our world. Yeah,
like
there's a specter haunting Europe, but in this case, it's not the specter of communism. It's just the illiberal wave, the return of illiberalism, and it started in the mid 2000s.
Yeah,
and interestingly, it started right when productivity slowed down.
Man. I mean,
probably coincidence.
Is that just?
If you look at the Freedom House rankings, right? If you look at Freedom House, it's just down in the U.S., down in India, like the two largest democracies, the two like biggest bastions or whatever democracy, down in those countries, repressive countries getting more repressive, liberal countries getting less liberal.
Yeah.
Only a few countries, some countries have resisted it, like Canada's resisted it, like Germany's resisted it, Japan has resisted it.
Yeah.
But then a lot of countries have been disrupted, and maybe it's the internet.
Yeah.
Maybe that was when we got broadband, and maybe we are seeing that, and maybe that has caused illiberalism because governments are cracking down hard in response to internet-driven protests and criticism and whatever. But so I don't actually know why, or maybe it's the United States screwed its credibility with Iraq. And maybe it's like when the arsenal of democracy shows that it's willing to just like invade and beat up other countries, maybe that discredited liberalism.
Discredited the whole project. Well,
Bill Kristol. Anyway, so like maybe that happened, and we don't really know why, but it could just be the economic success of China.
Okay. Well,
it could just be that.
I mean, because there was some precedent to the success of the relative economic success in a very quick period of time of a liberal regime with the Soviets, and for a much shorter time with the Nazis in the 30s. I know that the Nazi economy was sort of a house of cards built on sand, but it looked very impressive for a few years to people, before the war began, and the rapid development of the Soviet Union. It seemed to be impressive, a model that a lot of countries looked at. I mean,
those are both really fundamentally war economies.
Yeah. I mean, but a lot of people in the world, though, looked at that and said, that's where the future is,
That's right.
So you think maybe it's
But
something
look,
like that?
I mean,
You know?
you don't have to think that being like China will make you rich.
Yeah.
You can look at Singapore and think being like Singapore will make you rich.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat authoritarian as well.
Yeah.
Not like China though. But you can. But the thing about Chinese power is that China is so damn big, 4 times the size of the United States. You know, it's China to the United States is like the United States to Britain. It's like that big of a difference.
Yeah.
And so, well, almost. It's like the United States to Germany, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a huge difference. And so even if China, I would argue that China's already surpassed our total economic output, and that any remaining difference in the one last benchmark, which is nominal GDP, is probably due to like measurement weirdness of exchange rates. But in other words, Chinese power does not require Chinese wealth. You don't have to have your average Chinese person living high on the hog for this giant country to have massive power. And if power is what people respond to and not wealth, I mean, like, you know, is everybody falling over themselves to imitate the like governmental system of like Singapore, Luxembourg, I don't know, whatever, like the richest countries in the world, Norway, Qatar, all. I guess you have to have oil to imitate Qatar. Or Norway, but like you could, are people like imitating the richest countries, or are they influenced by the biggest powerful country? The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union exerted a huge influence in the world, even though its economy was kind of shambolic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point out maybe power over wealth there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got some. I mean, so that's not exactly the point that I wanted to end on, and I'm
but
scared.
Maybe the protests. So what I'm saying is that maybe the protests were people across the world kicking against this wave of darkness.
Yeah.
And their governments weren't standing up to it, and they were like, no, we're going to go into the streets and we're going to protest against whatever local assholes happen to be the local assholes.
Yeah.
We're going to protest against whatever we have because in some sense we feel that the wrong people are in charge of the world now. The world is being ruled by the wrong people now.
Yeah.
And that's the darkness. The darkness is just like the illiberalism puts the wrong rulers in power. Yeah. And that has crept over the world in our country as well. You know, we put Trump in power and Modi, whatever. And then Britain managed to dodge a bullet even despite Brexit. They've actually, you know, Boris Johnson was better than we thought. But yeah, so I think that a lot of people were just instinctively kicking out against the illiberalism because people don't want to live under the constraints of bad oppressive government. And so there's your neoliberalism that we're going to end on.
That sounds good.
People don't want the government to like be overbearing and rule their lives.
That works for me.
Like that.
I like that. I like that idea. But can I ask you a few questions from our audience?
Absolutely,
go. Because we've got as ever, just I've got this ADD brain. So when you go in a different direction, I'm just like, yes, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Oh,
me too.
Hour's up, right? So some questions here. Will Pyler asks, and you might know more about this than I think you'll know more about this than I will. Can you ask Noah about the trilemma of the service economy? I'm not familiar with the trilemma of the service economy. Will Pyler says.
I'm also not. Let me Google that. Hold on. Service economy trilemma.
Yeah.
The trilemma of the service economy. That's a 1998 paper. Iverson and Wren. Hold on. Let me look at this.
Okay.
Oh no, it's got no abstract. I hate that. Make an abstract, you. I don't know. I will look that up and get back to you.
All right. Well, let's see. Apparently well, we'll save that. Maybe you can spell it out a little bit more well, but don't know about that one. Let's see. Glass-Steagall, yay or nay?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, doesn't matter. Fair point.
Glass-Steagall was an example of like us banning whatever, like taking whatever had just caused a financial crisis and banning it.
Yeah. All right.
They're always those regulations are always backward looking, but it might be that if we repeal Glass-Steagall someday, the confluence of commercial investment banking might cause another financial crisis.
Yeah. So we just don't know because they're kind of those sorts of rules are inherently backward looking. And
yeah, it's not that important.
okay. Do you think? I know we talked a little bit about Iraq, and a little bit about. I guess this subject is inherently tied into globalization. Intervening in the affairs of other countries, interventionism. Generally speaking, I mean, do you think that era is that the United States is mostly done with that? You think that's a good thing, a bad thing? What do you see on the horizon?
We're not done with it. We're not done with it. And it is something that we should try to limit, but that we occasionally need to do. And Franklin Roosevelt made the right case when he said that basically countries are like neighbors, and if you don't intervene when stuff is going on your block, like you're not a good neighbor if you just hide in your house. You're not a good neighbor. And sometimes you get it wrong.
Would you support a rest of the world trade war with China, which I suppose would be getting together with other countries and then, I guess taking the Trumpian approach, but, not unilaterally?
Yeah. Let's do it. It won't happen.
Yeah.
But, how about we just do the damn TPP?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, it seems like Joe Biden. I don't know if he's protectionist at heart or not, but he seems to be giving a lot of lip service to it. So,
Joe Biden, he doesn't see a lot of upside to the TPP, but there would be.
Yeah.
Or no, instead, what Joe Biden is going to do is he's going to push the Quad Plus. So the Quad is this emerging. Not an Asian NATO, really not an Asian NATO.
Yeah.
With us, Japan, India, and Australia. And so the Quad Plus includes Vietnam, it includes New Zealand, and South Korea.
Yeah.
And I also think we should put Indonesia in that mix. I think that would be really advantageous. But anyway, the Quad Plus, I think, is going to eventually become the substitute for the TPP, in that we'll say, these are our strategic partners and we need to open our markets to them.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Maybe that's the best we can do.
What about, one of this is sort of the defining story, I guess, of the 21st century seems like this idea that populations are going to start to crash sort of everywhere. Particularly, I guess, in the next 20 years, the big story will be in China, where they're set to start crashing pretty quickly. But the big exception here seems to be Africa, which is set to boom. Population, which seems to be finally getting some, not everywhere, but some stability generally, is getting investment, not just from China, but, a lot of investment from China. A new look, in the United States in turn is taking a new look. What do you think about Africa in the next few years? How's that going?
Yeah. So
what a question, right?
So African fertility is now falling.
Oh.
So Africa is joining the fertility transition at a lower income level than almost anywhere else except India. So if you in the long run, African fertility will fall, and it's already. You can look at all the lines. Fertility transition is underway. Total. Let me look at the total fertility rate for Sub-Saharan Africa. Total fertility, we say Sub-Saharan Africa so that we can say that North Africa is really part of the Middle East. But okay, it's down to 4.7 in 2015 in the late 2010s. Yeah. It was down to 4.7. That is, like a pre-fertility transition country is like 5 to 7. Really? So it's already, once you get below 5, you're in the fertility transition. Africa is in the fertility transition as a whole, and some countries are much farther advanced than others. So it's not like African population is going to be like to the moon, Dogecoin, but Africa got started economically a lot later, so it's going to take longer for that to go down, and African population is going to increase by at least 1 billion.
Yeah.
There's going to be at least another billion Africans, maybe 2 billion, 1 to 2 billion more Africans. Yeah. It's a lot. And so those people, that's going to put a strain on environmental resources. We'll have to figure out how to, do whatever. And so that's going to happen. But I'm optimistic about Africa's short-term economic future. But I think that we haven't seen any African country go into the rapid industrialization that we see in that we're now seeing in almost every Asian country,
Yeah.
that we saw in some Asian countries before, that we saw in almost all European countries before.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not seeing it. We're also not seeing it in Latin America and the Middle East, because those places are very commodity based.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to see it in South Asia. We're seeing it in Bangladesh, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We thought Ethiopia was going to be the first.
Yeah, it was doing so good, and then like COVID happened and we weren't paying attention, but now it's in the midst of civil war and ethnic cleansing in the Tigray region. I mean,
Ethiopia went to hell. However, it's possible that since so much of the investment there was Chinese, that the Chinese won't care, and that they'll just keep putting money in and be like, oh, that civil war's off in that remote province. Who cares? Yeah. And they'll put the factories, they'll keep putting in factories, and actually Ethiopia will be fine. I mean, like if you looked at European countries during their rapid industrialization, they went to war all the time.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
So like, including civil wars sometimes.
Yeah.
And so like, wars can derail you, but it's still a possibility Ethiopia might do it.
Yeah, I guess that is like Germany was like rapidly industrializing in the midst of 3 wars. I mean,
right.
Well, so to kind of, I guess, tie all of this together and also to talk a little bit about the original issues I was going to ask you about climate and development. We've got one question here.
Yeah, okay.
I know, but this is the last question.
All right.
From Will Pyler, who says, if we do end up with an increase on global temperatures of 2.5 degrees, will the market still be, which seems like where we're going, will markets still be the best tool for development, or will we need to start taking more, for lack of a better word, authoritarian measures to stem disaster?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. Natural disasters cause big government interventions.
Yeah.
Floods, people get moved, you build flood defenses, all kinds of things, crop failures, like all these things, wildfires. You will have government policy aimed at mitigating these.
Yeah.
It's going to be interventionist.
I know.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen,
buckle up,
because between the climate, the growth of the developing world, and of course our national conservatives here at home, we will have what is the Chinese curse? We will live in interesting times.
It's going to be a rough couple of decades going forward.
Yeah. That Chinese population crash in the 2040s. A lot riding on that, right?
Right.
So we'll see.
All right. That's going to happen. That's baked into the cake. I have a whole post about that called Chinese Demography, if you're a Guns N' Roses fan.
So you don't think that's like some kind of Western hope, or like, we're just rolling the dice? And
I'm not sure it's a hope at all. I don't hope that this happens.
Yeah, I don't. Well,
I would like demographies to be demographics to be stable, not
to be clear in what
exponential one way or the other.
Right. To be clear what I mean there, I'm not saying that I hope people are
that's going to be a
poverty.
Pain in the ass for China.
What I mean is just the idea that this rising power maybe will not be rising so quickly vis-a-vis the United States.
yes, but also they know this,
and
it could scare them into quick action.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's right. But here's I'd like to end on a positive note. During the 21st century, during the 2000s, during the century, we have had the absolutely catastrophic Bush-Gore election. We had the bursting of the tech bubble, the absolutely catastrophic Bush-Gore election, massive corporate accounting scandal that sort of damaged our corporate America long term. We had 9/11. We had all that shit, war on terror. We had the disastrous Iraq war, which was disastrous even though we won it.
Yeah, that's a real
disaster that we won.
Yeah,
massively Pyrrhic victory. We had all those things. We had the Great Recession and the housing bubble crash that destroyed the wealth of a generation and destroyed our economic system in many ways. We had the election of Trump, massive social divisions, all these things, and then COVID, a once-in-a-century pandemic. We have had a lot of shit happen to us in the first 2 decades of this century. And guess what? we are now in active mode. It took a lot of things for us to wake up and say things must change. We must actively address our problems instead of hoping that things get better and we revert to the mean. But we have woken up now, and we're gonna do big things. And if the Nat Cs decide to try to derail us or whatever, they take your best shot. But I think that instead they should get with the program and be actual nationalists and not just put it in their name, and actually support the actual country we have instead of some fantasy like whiteified 1950s parody nation that exists in your head. That's bullshit. We're never going to that. It never even existed in the first place, and if it had, we wouldn't even be going back to it. So get with the program. It's a diverse damn country. Get on board with that, guys. Like, it's a diverse country.
And we're doing big things again.
Yeah, either we succeed as a multiracial nation or we don't succeed as a nation at all. Yeah. Like, there's no two ways about it. True. And so you're not going to do like some partition of India, ethnic cleansing bullshit. That's not going to happen. You'll just go to jail. And like, that will be it, jail. Yeah. And so don't do that. Yeah. Don't be a Richard Spencer. Don't, just give that up forever. And don't be a Trump. Don't act out. Don't throw tantrums. Just try to make this country work.
Sounds good. I'm down for that. Yeah, I'm down for that.
To the National Conservatives.
Try to make this country work, because it seems like we've woken up. We are in a problem-solving mode once again. A lot of smart people working on a lot of problems that we've just ignored for a long time. So with that, Noah Smith, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for giving us a few extra minutes there for some of the great questions we had. And thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure.
Until next time.